Got a new #1 in the college football playoff rankings. LSU, after beating Alabama, gets its highest ranking in the CFP era. Ohio State won, but the resume not quite what LSU's is. They slipped to 2, Clemson at 3, and Georgia moves into that top 4 spot. Alabama and Oregon in the top 6. Joining us now is the chair of the College Football Playoff Selection Committee, Rob Mullens, who's also the athletic director at the University of Oregon. Just to get this out of the way, Rob recuses himself whenever Oregon is discussed in the committee room. Rob, seemed pretty easy for us that LSU was going to move into #1. Was it that decisive in the room?
Well, I mean, obviously we spent some time discussing it. You got 2 great teams at the top, LSU and Ohio State. And just like I said last week, the committee's really impressed with Ohio State and the consistent level of high play. But when you look at LSU's resume with the win over Alabama on the road, that makes their 4th top 20 win, and they're the only team in the nation with that. They're deserving of that #1 ranking.
Okay, so we were all fascinated with how 4 through, I guess, probably about 9 or 10 would shake out. Georgia winds up in the 4th spot. How would you characterize the discussions for all of those teams in that grouping, understanding that you end up with them putting them in there 3 teams at a time? How would you characterize those discussions?
Well, obviously, I'm recused from the room when Oregon's on the board. But as you look at 4 and 5, the discussion around those 2 teams was, 2 really good teams. Obviously, 1-loss teams. We just saw Alabama had a tough loss against LSU. But you compare that against Georgia's resume, and they're 2 big wins that Georgia had. And then when the committee reported to me, when you get to Oregon and Utah, as we mentioned last week, Oregon has the win over USC. Utah lost to USC. And obviously, you can see the move of Minnesota and how the committee was impressed with the win over Penn State.
Okay, so that brings me to Minnesota, and then make this huge jump, unprecedented in the college football playoff era in terms of leaping into the top 10. How big a difference? I mean, obviously, they're playing great now. They weren't early in the season. How is that being evaluated in the committee room, their improvement?
Well, that's a piece of it. I mean, obviously, we're looking at the full resume. As we mentioned last week, a non-conference schedule wasn't as strong as some. And then they had only played 1 team in their league with a winning record until Penn State. But when you watched the game last week, they beat a Penn State team that was then ranked #4 and had pressed in committee until that point. We were really impressed with what Minnesota did.
How close, and for people who don't know, you put teams up on the board, the top 3 vote getters move in, and then you have the next round with 3 more teams added. I'm not explaining it precisely because you need a lot of time to do so. Well, let me ask you this. How close was Minnesota to being even higher?
They were in that pool of, as you mentioned, we work with teams, pools of 6. So they're in, typically a team is in that range of 4 to 9. So they were in that discussion in that pool from in those ranges. Okay,
and the other issue, the committee early on had Clemson at #5. It seemed largely due to stopping a 2-point conversion against a team with a mediocre record. Same thing happens to Oklahoma on Saturday night, and the Sooners slip a spot. Was that the biggest impact on Oklahoma's ranking, the fact that they had to survive against a team that maybe is better than its record, but the record is mediocre?
Well, again, we're not just looking at one game, but we are aware of the game. And when we look at Oklahoma's schedule, obviously we know that their 1 loss is to K-State. They beat a good Texas team. But, of course, we know exactly what happens last week, and we're watching those games.
All right, Rob, I've got one more quick one then. How does that reflect on the way the committee feels about the Big 12? Because Baylor has won its games, but it has yet to really make a climb.
Yeah, I mean, similar to last week, when you look at Baylor's non-conference schedule, their 3 non-conference opponents have won a total of 6 games. Obviously, Baylor has some great wins. They're certainly figuring out how to win in close games. But at this point, the committee felt they belonged at #13.
All right, Rob, thanks a lot for being with us.